Okay. So, welcome back, Shalhoun. We are going to be continuing the series we've been covering. The Abolition for the People is a series of 30 essays by Kaepernick Publishing. This one is titled We Must Center Black Women. It is written by Kimberlé Crenshaw. She is most known for actually introducing the theory of intersectionality, and is actually involved in a lot of different writing on the subject of critical race theory, intersectionality. She's a lawyer and civil rights activist and such. Founder of the Columbia Law School's Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies and the African American Policy Forum. So she's definitely very well positioned to be contributing to the Abolition for the People series. If you're unaware of intersectionality as a theory, I guess, elevator pitch of it, explanation of it, is different types of discrimination. Let's say when someone is subject to multiple types of discrimination, like if they are a part of multiple marginalized groups simultaneously, those cannot be considered in isolation. They actually combine to create a new form of discrimination and act kind of like force multipliers with each other. So like the primary example is black women. You can't look at the problems black women face as what do those what issues do black men face, and simultaneously what issues do white women face. The issues black women face are unique. They think of it like layers of color wheels, right? Like if you have if you're shining a sheet of light through translucent things and you've got like a red lens and then you put a blue lens in front of it, you don't get just red and blue. Those combine to create something different. So that's basically theory of intersectionality. It's when you think about it in those terms, it's kind of self-evident, but it's not something that has had really been considered philosophically or seriously before. So anyway, hey garlic, let's go ahead and get into the essay itself. Okay. So, we must center black women. Sorry. My throat. Breonna Taylor and bearing witness to black women's expendability. Why say her name is crucial to the struggle for black freedom. By Kimberlé Crenshaw. September 23. Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron delivered a much-anticipated decision on whether Breonna Taylor's killers would be prosecuted. Guided by Cameron's judgment of the legality of the officers' actions, a grand jury decided that none of the officers involved in killing Breonna Taylor would stand trial for her death. Obviously, that is something we covered. There is all kinds of BS around that decision, such as the grand jury basically being led to that decision. But continuing on, Cameron's gut-wrenching announcement came on the 65th anniversary of another jury decision that absolved white men for a murder that transformed the nation. On September 23, 1955, 12 white jurors took less than 2 hours to acquit 2 white men of torturing and killing 14-year-old Chicago native Emmett Till in Money, Mississippi. Mammy Till's decision to hold an open casket funeral for her son, in order to, in her words, let the people see what they did to my boy, awakened an entire generation of young African Americans to take up the centuries-long struggle for black freedom. Her simple act demanded that the world bear witness to the profound savagery of white racism and to reckon with the complicitous legal system that effectively facilitated its ongoing horrors. Tiny bit of background. Emmett Till was accused of, not legally accused, was accused of basically catcalling at a white woman, or flirting with her. In retaliation, he was beaten and mutilated and lynched. 14 years old, again. And yeah, they decided, like she mentions, that his killers would be acquitted. Indeed, the galvanizing dimension of Emmett... Yeah, he was 14. And mind you, that wasn't even police. That was just some guys who decided to take it on themselves to kill this black boy. Indeed, the galvanizing dimension of Emmett Till's murder was not the shock that a lynching had happened in 1955, but that such a gruesome, unspeakable killing was licensed by a legal system that would hold no one accountable. Similarly, the state's judgment that no legal or moral harm had been done to Breonna Taylor offers an abject lesson in the contemporary ways that law has facilitated a particularly lethal relationship between black bodies and the police. The fact that the officers who killed her would be subject to no consequences for taking her life uncloaks both the failed structures of our legal system and the long overdue confrontation with how the contours of acceptable police practice are shot through with anti-black racism. This is the weird part to me, and like she's hinting at it, but it's not even just that they found the officers not guilty. The grand jury was led to the decision that no charges should even be filed and tried. These officers weren't even brought into a court to be judged. They just agreed that, oh, well, Breonna Taylor just, her being executed by police is just the cost of doing business and having police. It's... Yeah. Anyway, continuing on. This unveiling could well be a ground-shifting moment in the epic struggle against anti-black violence. Like the murder of Emmett Till 3 generations ago, the police killing of Breonna Taylor, and the legal judgment that lent it legitimacy may inspire a new generation to repudiate policing, illegitimate state power, and its legalized facilitation against black bodies. It's not just a decision that there were no wrongdoings, but that there could be no wrongdoing. Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's basically that they don't even accept that a crime could be considered there. That it's really gross and chilling. Because even if you were of the opinion that they should be found innocent and that maybe the killing was justified, the fact that it never even is going to see a day in court is deeply problematic. Because that's like, there's no other profession where you can just kill someone and there's like your actions are not even going to be judged. If there is a case to be made that the actions are justified and that these officers are innocent, make it in court. Don't just do this bury it under the rug thing. Of course, there's not such a case to be made. There's no justification for escalating in the way that police do over and over and over again. If Breonna's story serves as a cornerstone for a generation of activism like Emmett's did, it will foreground something new in the Black freedom struggle, something that the Say Her Name campaign has been fighting for since 2014. It will make all Black women central to any analysis of and challenge to anti-Blackness. Some will seize on the differences between the two killings to discount the relevance of Emmett Till's death to Breonna Taylor's. Emmett was tortured, killed by vigilantes enforcing Southern codes of white supremacy, and his killers were acquitted after a full trial by an all-white jury. The trial's faux murder mystery frame belied the fact that jurors had every reason to know that the two accused had conspired with others to kidnap and kill the 14-year-old boy. Their hasty acquittal amounted to a brazen act of jury nullification. Breonna, by contrast, was killed by sworn officers who were executing a warrant. Her death was ultimately framed by a grand jury, sealed proceedings headed up by Kentucky's African-American Attorney General, as a permissible homicide committed during the course of law enforcement. In both Breonna's and Emmett's death, the state blamed the victims for alleged behaviors that triggered the murderous responses by white men, empowered to exercise their prerogative to kill. Pretense abounded in both the assertion that there really was reasonable doubt that J.W. Millam and Roy Bryant killed Emmett Till, and that Miles Cosgrove, Brett Hankinson, and Jonathan Mattingly really had no choice but to shoot Breonna Taylor's home, stopping to reload after they encountered one shot from an occupant who had a right to fire it. The overkill on display in these murders renders the racially punitive aspects of both exceptionally legible. Neither death would be remotely imaginable had the racial roles been reversed. The contemporary failure to hold police accountable for their wanton disregard for black lives is as much an expression of embedded racial power as was the legal facilitation of white supremacist vigilante violence, and it has forced every black woman to confront a horrifying fact. Breonna could easily be me. This is a really interesting point, and it's one that does not get made often enough. It does get made, but it really needs to be made more frequently. The media response and the legal response had Breonna Taylor and her boyfriend been white, and especially if the officers had been black or, non-white in general, the way that it would be handled by the media and by the legal system would be vastly different. Part of that is not just, the legal system looks out for white people, but also because there would be a lot more social pressure. All of a sudden, there would be, white communities, which have, more of a majority screaming for justice, and the state would capitulate to that pressure. Consequently, that's why I find it so important that allies actually step up, not just, passively supporting these things, but actively promoting these ideas of anti-racism. We all exist in the same society, and we have to be able to stand together. That doesn't mean letting them, letting LGBT people fight their battles and letting black people fight their battles, letting Latinos fight their battles and Asians. It means calling out injustice, no matter who it is against, and, not stopping calling it out until things change. Anyway, like so many of us, Breonna had curled up in the arms of a loved one after a long day of work to watch a movie as she drifted off to sleep. In the wee hours of the morning, she was abruptly awakened by an attack on her home by persons unknown. It escalated after a single gunshot fired from her boyfriend in self-defense prompted at least 32 rounds from the plainclothes firing squad, attempting to annihilate them both. After being struck by a fusillade of bullets, she took her last breath as her boyfriend begged her to stay with him, never knowing that the very men who took her life were the same men sworn to protect her. I really appreciate this very human breakdown of the events, because, it gets covered in the news, but this really, illustrates what the situation was from her and her boyfriend's perspective. It's brief, it's simple, it's just they were probably asleep or half asleep at 3 a.m, curled up together. Suddenly there is shouting and banging on the door. He fires a shot out there, like a warning shot. And 32 shots are fired in response, including time for at least one of the officers to reload their weapon. This was not an attempt to actually arrest anyone. Those of us who have chanted, "We are Breonna Taylor," are saying that we can imagine our lifeless bodies left in the hallways of our homes. We can imagine ourselves exposed for hours, while uniformed vultures pick through the remnants of our lives, seizing upon choices we made, and those that were made for us, in order to quiet the qualms that might otherwise arise had we been another woman in a different body, in a different part of town, living a different life, with a different man endeavoring to protect us. We can watch in our mind's eye the belated but widespread saying of our names to insist that our shuttered futures would be made to count for something. We can feel the hope that, with the gaze of the world finally upon us, that the fact that we had done nothing wrong would make it wrong that we'd been reduced to nothing. And we can taste the tears that mark our bitter awareness that despite the countless demands to arrest the cops that killed us, our deaths would ultimately be dismissed as just one of those things that happens. A no harm, no foul misfortune that counts among the acceptable costs of maintaining the anti-black foundations of police and policing. Reduced to collateral damage, our deaths can seem so natural that some black men dismiss them with the same breezy equation that Charles Barkley and Shaquille O'Neal did. A man had shot at intruders in self-defense, and for his mistaken belief that the right to self-defense applies to us, our deaths are justified. Black women like Breonna Taylor have been shunted by race, class, and gender into a place far from the gated neighborhoods men like Barkley and O'Neal have been permitted to occupy. It's hard to believe that the same violence and the same justification would be accepted had it been their wives or girlfriends whom they'd sought to protect. A little background there, those two more or less came out, downplaying the murders, which isn't a huge surprise considering the extreme, wealth privilege that both of them enjoy. But it is depressing, and unfortunately when voices like that come out justifying police murders, people who buy into propaganda latch on to those kinds of voices as authorities, since they are black men as well. And since they are prominent black men, they unfortunately outsize the overwhelmingly large majority of black voices that are crying out that it is not justice. But anyway, this double loss of life, first at the hands of police, and then in the justification of death, might otherwise have continued unaddressed were it not for the fact that this time, the whole world has borne witness. The open and notorious exposure of the brutal truth that lays beneath the surface of law and order justification is fully legible with unprecedented clarity. Breonna, like Emmett, lost her life according to the false imperative that this is just the way things have to be. It's a lie built around a contingent set of practices that reflect and sustain a historic pattern of police power that is racist and patriarchal. Shaquille has a fondness for the police and runs with them in Miami. Yeah. I mean, when you get ultra wealthy, a lot of times you end up rubbing shoulders with cops because they... I mean, even more than protecting white power, they're protecting wealth and the privileged. Yeah, it is. Very creepy. Breonna Taylor's murder stands as a potential historical parallel to Emmett Till's only if the gendered racism that black women have always faced is understood to be as vital to our justice demands as was the gendered racism that killed Emmett Till. Emmett's body forced us to confront the volcanic reservoir of white supremacy that was fed a boy's life, a ritualistic sacrifice born out of the white male ownership of white women. His murder was a blood sport that was inhumane even if the claims that preceded it had been true. That it was predicated on a lie adds but an asterisk to the horror it unleashed. That the murder was situated as a conflict between men, supposedly between a black boy and white men over the sexual ownership of a white woman's body, did not diminish that Emmett's death was a symbol of the overarching subordination of the entire black community. Its gendered specificity only enhanced the virulence of anti-black racism, writing Emmett into a long history of legal and extra-legal lynchings that was understood as the quintessential embodiment of white supremacy. His murder helped frame a zoomed-out view of how lost lives in the 1950s were linked to lost lives in the 1930s, 20s, 1870s, and 1610s. It was a murder that connected a chain of tyranny expressed from within law and at its margins. Yeah, there's a lot that she's hitting on here, kind of pinging around. There's a lot problematic about that lynching, not just the fact that a 14-year-old boy was kidnapped and savagely murdered and tortured. That by itself is horrific. But also, like, it's not just racial at that point. There also is this gendered component, this concept of ownership, like she mentions. Like, it wasn't the white woman who was allegedly offended, and as it turns out, was not actually flirted with by the boy. She wasn't involved. It was men acting on her behalf because of that weird perception of owning white women. That's where it gets to the patriarchal side of things. And it's really creepy. It's really disturbing. This notion of, like, I can understand I can understand wanting to avenge a loved one if he or she were actually, like, wronged. But the extent to which it was taken, that breadth of escalation, is kind of mind-boggling. Like, he was accused of basically catcalling. And sure, that could be considered rude. Give a measured response, you know? Anyway, Emmett Till's death continues to ground a particular vision of anti-black racism rooted in patriarchal white supremacy. But the telling remainder of that story is in the discarding of black women as subjects of anti-black racism. For us to mobilize around Breonna Taylor in the same way our foremothers and forefathers mobilized around Emmett, we must bear witness to the ways that black women's precarity is a continuous enactment of surveillance and punishment grounded in slavery's logics. To bear witness to this buried history, we must equip ourselves with tools to excavate and recover. This is the work of the African American Policy Forum and our Say Her Name campaign, to recenter black women's vulnerability as the subject of anti-racist mobilization. Turning back the clock on Say Her Name links Breonna's vulnerability in her own home to the fact that black women were unsafe in the slave quarters, in the fields, and in the homes of white people that they worked for. It regrounds anti-racism in the reality that black women have never had the right to self-defense, at least not one that the state was bound to respect. Thinking of Say Her Name within the broader historical context opens up the possibility of reclaiming what's been forgotten and recalibrating our imaginations in a way that broadens the scope of what we are fighting for today. It expands the scope of the state's role in facilitating, licensing, and authorizing multiple forms of violence against us. I really like this framing that she does of taking an event and using it to pull history into the picture. It's horrible that it needs to be done, but it's very effective. And she's right. Like there is actually an outsized focus, and this is not to downplay it, but there is and has been an outsized focus on the conflict between black men and issues of race, and it is absolutely and like issues with the police, and that has started to become understood and is still an abomination, but there does need to be an understanding of the struggle that black women are also faced with, and it's a more unique set of challenges, whereas black men are viewed as a threat, right? Like, that's the justification that police always uses, that they're thuggish and threatening and powerful, and the other side of that coin is that black women are not only powerless but completely without agency in the eyes of law enforcement. They do exist to be discarded out of hand. They're just like a byproduct of they're basically collateral damage, and that's as well as a sexual object. There's so much when you start looking at things from that broader historical lens. It's an abyss that you can dig through, especially if you look into historic examples. It can shake your faith in humanity, but it's a conversation worth having all the same. Anyway, continuing on. Imagine how integral the fight against misogyny might have become had Fannie Lou Hamer's struggles against forced sterilization been as centered in the discourses against racism as her struggle to vote was. One can only dream about how sexual harassment and assault would be centered as a form of anti-black racism if Rosa Parks' entry into the American imagination began when she was a rape crisis advocate for Reese Taylor. And one can only envision the world we would be living in now if race and gender had not been violently torn apart when Anita Hill came forward and told her story. Building on Say Her Name and imagining safe futures for all Black women would be a firm step toward a new social order without the terror of the anti-Blackness that fuses policing in the United States. It would mean not simply becoming witnesses of history, but being activists contesting the consequences of that history in the here and now. It would mean ensuring that the Emmett Tills, Eric Garners, Tamir Rice's, George Floyd's, and Mike Brown's are linked to the Breonna Taylor's, Michelle Cusseau's, Tanisha Anderson's, Kayla Moore's, and India Kager's. All Black lives lost to police violence. It would mean that all Black women are fully centered in every effort to dismantle the barriers to Black freedom. It is now up to those of us invested in confronting and challenging this vicious history to decide whether Breonna's killing will mobilize an entire generation to foreground and challenge the many gender dimensions of anti-Black racism. For our Say Her Name campaign, this means working directly with the mothers and sisters of Black women, girls, and femmes killed by police, and amplifying their testimony to inform our activism. These mothers, like Mamie Till 65 years ago, are fighting to show the world what the law did to their children and to seed a movement to do something about it. Join them and us in fighting for a history that could have been, one in which all Black lives mattered. Yeah. So yeah, it's a intersectionality is a very useful lens to start analyzing some of the horrors that people face, and being able to break events down beyond just being racial is a helpful practice. Recognizing how anti-Blackness impacts Black men, drives white men to act in certain ways, especially or is fairly different than those challenges and the manifestations of anti-Blackness against women. And when you dig into the media coverage of some of these, when it comes to women, it's largely there's an attempt to kind of sweep things under the rug. Whereas with Black men especially, there's an effort to just paint it as they were threatening and violent. The two behaviors are different and, tragic in very unique ways. I'm still working on understanding intersectionality a bit more myself. I'm not an expert on the subject. Still have a lot of reading to do. But yeah. That was We Must Center Black Women. And that was the 9th essay of the Abolition for the People series, examining law enforcement and making the case for actual police and prison abolition.